here. Okay. All right, welcome everybody. I'm Jillian Turnbull. I am the Director of Writing and Publishing here at King's. Thank you for joining us this Sunday, whether it's late morning where you are, late afternoon, whatever the case may be. We appreciate your taking time to be with us to talk about writing your book. I'm going to get us going with a little land acknowledgement and introduction of everybody, and then I will turn things over to our panelists. The University of King's College is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. I encourage you to find out about the lands on which you live, which you can do on native-land.ca. We also acknowledge our African Nova Scotia heritage. African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched Mi'kma'ki and Nova Scotia for over 400 years. Here at King's, we are engaging in the practice of storytelling, an impulse and practice that defines us as humans. One of the best ways to better know who we are, where we come from, and how we relate to one another is through story. And I encourage you to anchor your own understandings of the land, traditions, history, and cultural heritage by listening to and sharing in the stories of others. So welcome to our panel titled Write Your Book. As I said earlier, I'm Jillian Turnbull, and I direct the Writing and Publishing program here at King's. And this program houses two MFA streams, one in fiction and one in creative nonfiction. Over 60 books have been published out of the creative nonfiction stream, which we are now in our 10th year of. And we also just added our fiction stream in June of 2023. So we've had a lot of books come out of our program, and we love to talk about books, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the different stages of book writing, tackling some of the areas where even the most experienced of authors can get stuck. On top of that, the book industry is one that sees ongoing change, and figuring out who your audience is and how to connect with them can be difficult. But of course, alongside these questions we might have about audience and the industry, we have the biggest one of all, which is how can I put these ideas I have kicking around in my brain into a coherent and compelling story? Well, I'm very pleased to have with us today several faculty members with the King's MFA program. They're all experts on different hurdles the book writing process presents. So what I'm going to do is introduce all of them to you now, and I'll get them to just put their hand up and maybe unmute and say hi so that you can see them at the top of your screen of participants. And then once I've introduced everyone, we'll hear a short presentation from each of our faculty members. As they're speaking, feel free to put questions into the chat, and I will keep track of all of those, and I'll round them all up for the Q&A portion of our panel at the end. So first of all, we have MFA cohort Director Dean Job. Dean, do you want to just open up and say hi to everyone?
Hello, thanks for coming.
So Dean's new book, A Gentleman and a Thief, coming from HarperCollins Canada in June, is the rollicking story of a jazz-age thief who stole jewels worth millions from New York's elite. Dean is the author of The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream, longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction, and Empire of Deception, the story of a 1920s Chicago conman. Dean writes a monthly column on true crime for Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, and he's going to offer advice on getting into and out of the research for your book. Charlotte Gill, do you want to say hi, Charlotte?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Charlotte is the author of Lady Killer, a short fiction collection, and Eating Dirt, a tree planting memoir. Her latest book, Almost Brown, is a mixed-race family story published by Penguin Random House. Her fiction and narrative nonfiction have appeared in Vogue, The Guardian, Oprah Daily, LitHub, The Walrus, and many other newspapers and magazines. She is a cohort director in fiction at King's and will talk to us today about personal narrative and beyond. We also have Kim Pittaway with us. Do you want to say hello, Kim?
Hi, everybody. Good to see you.
Kim is a cohort director in nonfiction in the King's MFA in Creative Nonfiction program. She is the co-author with Tufa Jallow of Tufa, the woman who inspired an African Me Too movement, which the New York Times described as riveting and propulsive. She's also the co-author with Samra Zafar of Unconditional, forthcoming from HarperCollins Canada in 2025. Prior to focusing on book-length projects, Kim was a longtime magazine feature writer and editor, and former editor-in-chief of Chatelaine magazine. And she's going to be talking today about the process, rewards, and challenges of ghostwriting. And finally, we have Stephen Kimbers. Stephen Kimbers, say hello to everyone.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you.
So Stephen is the MFA Fiction Cohort Director and also our program's founder. He is the author of 14 books. His books have been published by 8 different publishers, from big national and international houses to regional and local imprints. And he's even dabbled in commissioned and self-publishing, which is one reason why we asked him to talk about working with your publisher, big or small or not at all. So to start with, I'm going to turn things over to Dean, who is going to talk to us about researching for your book. Take it away, Dean.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Jillian. And I don't know if in my bio I said exactly what I do in the program. I think it's going to become painfully obvious that I'm cohort director in nonfiction. But I'm going to talk about research in a more general sense because it doesn't just apply to nonfiction. A number of years ago, a writer in residence in the program was someone I think you'll know very well, Charlotte Gray, probably a preeminent popular historian writing for a popular audience. And in one of the sessions she had, she said something that I could relate to. She said, writing a book is work. It's hard work, but researching a book, especially a historical narrative, is fun. And it really is. It's like a treasure hunt and the thrill of the chase. You don't know where threads are going to lead. You don't know what nuggets of gold or information you're going to find. So I do a lot of research, okay? And I do that because I feel as a writer, I have to immerse myself in a time, in a place, in characters, in events. Because if I don't do that, how am I going to immerse you as the reader? An author you may know of, he's sort of the US equivalent of Charlotte Gray, named David McCullough, passed away not long ago. A Pulitzer Prize winning writer of popular history in the States. And he once described his practice as marinating his head. He did a biography of John Adams, the second president of the United States. Oh, I got that right. Well, one of the early presidents of the United States. And to do that, he not only immersed himself in Adams's world through newspapers and memoirs and letters and archival materials, but Adams was well read. So he even read the same great works of classical authors from 200 years ago, the same writers that Adams read. Again, all by way of just trying to get inside his subject. So my first advice is read everything you can and look everywhere you can. So that's newspapers. Never been easier to do this. When I started doing historical research a while ago, we didn't have newspaper databases, either free or for charge. As well, you want to get into diaries and memoirs, but not only that relate directly to your subject events, but just that help you understand the time and place again. What were people saying? What were they thinking? You'll go to archives. I was a court reporter, a legal affairs reporter in another life. So I'm thoroughly convinced that one of the great windows into the past is court records. Who sued who? I do true crime, so I'm looking for certain crimes, but as well just understanding the rich trove of material that, believe it or not, even 100 years later might still be at the original courthouse, not even in an archive. And it's not just information. I'm thinking I also look for images, old postcards, old press photos, or ephemera, concert tickets, bus passes, the kind of paper that we would throw out every day that again would help you understand the past. And I also look for unconventional sources. I usually get a chuckle out of people to say one of my main sources is eBay. And that's because eBay is chock full of vintage postcards. There's some great vintage news photo sites. And right now I'm doing a project where I need to know about somebody's schooling 100 years ago and also about the theaters of New York in 1920. And I started with eBay and I'm finding playbills, I'm finding student publications from this particular school. And anyway, so it's a great untapped resource. And as well, I mean, if you can just look at a vintage postcard for your research, but you can actually buy it, usually quite cheaply, as an illustration for your book. And getting some of these images from licensed sources, say Getty Images, would be prohibitively expensive, but as well, they may not be there. This could be one of the few in existence. So my research advice there, shop early, shop often. Um, and the other source is academic books, academic histories. They may seem dry, but you can sometimes I mine them for information, not just the context, but sometimes my best quotes come from there. And in my new book, I talk about the 20s, and I wanted to give people a sense of change. And one was that the automobile burst on the scene, and at one point, one study found that more people had cars than had bathtubs in their homes. And one American farmer was asked, well, why this was, and thought it was pretty obvious. Well, you can't drive to town in a bathtub. And I thought that's a great little snicker of a quote, but it also is telling about the time and place. And also go there. No matter how far back in time you're traveling with your subject and you're going to take your readers, buildings and streetscapes may still be there, may have survived. And it's really good to move through that physical space in the footsteps of your characters that you're looking for. And I highly recommend guided tours. If an event happened in some historic hotel, take the tour. You'll learn a lot of nuggets and information and just soak it up. During the pandemic, I got to say it was quite frustrating. Could not travel. Had to rely on researchers or emailed requests. But even then, there is something called Google Streetscapes. And while I couldn't chase one of my characters, I couldn't go to the area of rural New Jersey where my character spent some years. I actually spent about an hour virtually driving there on Google Street Maps, even though there was really nothing much to see, just to see if I could get a sense of the lay of the land, which I then incorporated a line in the book. Now, this isn't just for nonfiction history and the kind of historical true crime I write. Memoir. If you're writing a memoir, you've got your own recollections, but how do you then test that against, do you remember things clearly? And you're going to be doing interviews, you're going to be doing research, obviously, with other people who were around or family members. How do you test their recollections, especially when they vary from yours? Well, one way is to do the kind of research. Was there coverage in the paper? What was the small town like? What was the population? What was the weather like on a given day? There are resources for all of these questions. And Lyndon McIntyre, who I'm sure you're familiar with, who only won that Giller Prize thing. I think you might have heard of that. Well, he's a nonfiction writer, a journalist who also writes fiction, but he did a memoir called Causeway about growing up in Cape Breton, near where the Canso Causeway was built in the 50s. And Lyndon said, he thought he remembered the past, and then he found this little local museum was a treasure trove of old clippings, things that mattered to Port Hastings and his community. And it wasn't just what he verified. It was all the stuff he'd forgotten that was twigged by seeing this and having this information. So it's also for memoir writers, and it's also for fiction writers. One of the students in the inaugural fiction stream is doing an historical novel based in Grand Falls, which was a community created for a pulp mill by a British press baron. And the student is now going soon to the British Library to research this press baron's papers, all in the service of a fictional account, but he's very much doing exactly what I would do. So there's a lot of overlap. So as I said, the good news is it's never been easier to do this. And it's important to know as well, because of the internet, but it's important to know as well, not everything's on the internet. So you can't just do a Google search and say, oh, I guess there's nothing, right? You might find a reference, as this fiction student did, to a press baron as information on Grand Falls was important there. You can see there are files of letters. You don't see the letters. You don't even necessarily see a breakdown. So you still have to make inquiries. You may still have to go. And it's especially true for newspapers. Some of the best stuff I got for my current project on A Gentleman Jewel Thief was from the Worcester, Massachusetts newspapers, which I had to have a researcher go through because they had to do them old school. They were only on microfilm, had to look at key dates. So remember that as well. So how much is too much? Well, David McCullough, when he was doing John Adams, says, how far would he go? He says, well, if I could have crossed the Atlantic on a 24-gun frigate like Adams did, I would have done it. Okay, just to soak in the experience. And a writer you may be familiar of, a nonfiction writer called Michael Finkel, who wrote a bestseller called The Art Thief recently, about a master painter, thief of artworks. And part of the story is that it looks like some priceless artworks worth millions of dollars. To avoid arrest, someone burned them. So Michael Finkel actually bought some old inexpensive oil paintings, piled them up, and burned them so we could see what happened, how quickly they burned, how the oil, as it melted, seeped into the soil, and he used this in his description. So how far is too far? That was the question, by the way, I was asked to address. Well, you don't really, but one piece of advice I've learned the hard way, I think, is that once you've got a chunk of the story, or if you've focused in and you've researched a chunk of the story, start writing. A few books ago, I was obsessively trying to gather a big pile of information, a big intimidating pile of information, and then starting to write. I think a better practice is write as you go and finish the research for one discrete section. If you've missed something, if you find something in further research, you can add it in on the redraft or on the fly. But what you do is you start getting manageable. You start getting chunks and chapters of the book, filling in the context, even some action, and it also helps you to manage that intimidation you feel of, oh my God, where do I start? And will I ever finish this? Well, suddenly you're still researching, but you're also getting draft material and getting closer to the end. And I think as well, it saves you time. Because once you get going with the writing, I think once you understand the narrative arc, you don't do as much extra research that you're going to leave on the cutting room floor. And I think it makes for a leaner, better process. And of course, it has the absolute added advantage of mixing the work with the treasure hunt. So I'll leave it there, and thanks for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dean. And now, of course, all I want to do is research. That's the whole reason I got into this. So you sparked that excitement again. I'm going to turn things over to Charlotte Gill now, who's going to talk to us about personal narrative and beyond. Charlotte.
Yeah, so I think this is a really good place to pick up because I am going to talk a little bit about narrative arcs, as Dean just mentioned. My presentation is really about first-person stories. These are classically what we know as memoir in creative nonfiction, but actually I think some of these things will apply to people who write other kinds of nonfiction, even people who write fiction. So I know that when we're in creative writing workshops and learning how to write in the process of how we're going to build our book, we often talk about, what am I going to write? But oftentimes I think it can be helpful to think about it in terms of what not to write. And by that, I don't mean necessarily, that very thorny issue of saying sensitive things about other people, although I'm very happy to address that in the Q&A afterwards. But I mean from a craft and technical perspective, because memoir is the stuff of life. We're taking the real life events that have happened to us and we're converting them into an art form. And, life is composed of 40 million moments, something like that. And if those were translated into pages, we'd have a book of 1,000,000 pages, and it would be very unwieldy, very fast. So just having accompanied writers through this process over the years, oftentimes in the early phases, in the developmental stages, and even kind of halfway into the writing, people really crave goalposts and some constraints on just how big the story is going to be. So I'm going to offer just a couple of tips today that come right from the workshops that I run at King's and in the past elsewhere. And before I do that, I want to make a distinction here between memoir, which is the craft form that we work in creative nonfiction, which is a curated chunk of a life. And oftentimes, as Dean said, these kinds of stories are very voice driven. They enter a world deeply, and they really celebrate everyday people, places, and things. And I want to distinguish that kind of writing from autobiography, which is what we often tend to see on the New York Times bestseller list. Very frequently, these are celebrities who are authors of these books, and they are often ghostwritten. Kim's going to talk about that later. And the timeline for these autobiographies is often most of a life, or as much a life as that person has lived. It starts at birth, maybe early family, and we, see the rise and sometimes failures of those famous people, and then we meet them in the current moment. But the kind of writing that memoir is, that we work on at King's, is oftentimes much, much tighter. So oftentimes when we begin a workshop session, the way that I do it, sometimes, I think many people think of creative writing classes as a stack of pages that you get from your peers, and there's a round table of critique. But I begin with a whiteboard with a question and answer session for the writer to really narrow down what it is exactly they want to do and their goals for their project. So first thing, I ask the writer of the day to identify on a big timeline that I create on the whiteboard with arrows on either end, where is the beginning point of the story? And oftentimes this is really quite difficult to pin down. Where do you envision the writer landing on page 1 specifically? What scene? Where are we? What year? Who are the people who are walking around in the scene? What is going to happen in the scene? And then by contrast, I ask them to think about the ending of the book, which can sometimes be more slippery. But what feeling do you want the reader to leave with? Where are we at the very end, specifically in space and time? Now, often, in the case of memoir, that is the writer sitting at the desk looking back. So we have also crossed, potentially quite a bit of time. But surprisingly, oftentimes what writers find is that timeline is a lot tighter than what they thought it was going to be in the beginning. They thought it could be decades, and sometimes people end up with a timeline that is really very short. So in the case of a childhood memoir, is that all of childhood? Does it go from 0 to 20? Or is it really just about the age of 13 to 16, for example? Same thing with books like, for example, medical memoirs. They oftentimes can take place in just a year or two. So often these are quite a bit tighter. And I think they give the writer a real sense of what they have to work with. And of course, that doesn't mean that there isn't backstory and other parts of the timeline that we have to account for, but it can be like a real comfort to know that the main part of the story is going to be told rather tightly in a chronological sense. So the next thing that I often ask is, who are the people who are going to populate the story? And again, sometimes the writer will just list out maybe 12 to 15 characters who will walk across the pages of their book. And that's great. Even knowing who the people are, who the dramatis personae are in your story is going to be very, very helpful, not only for memoir, but also for other kinds of nonfiction, potentially fiction as well. So I draw a big bullseye on the whiteboard with 3 rings. One is very small in the center, and you can probably guess what goes there. The next one is a little bit wider, and the third one is more distant still. Now, the first one is reserved for the narrator, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But that is the character who occupies the first person point of view. And in subsequent rings around the center circle, that's where all the other characters come into play. And then I will ask the writer of the day, how important are these characters? Who are the ones who show up very early in the story and kind of accompany the narrator through many of the scenes, if not most of them, and are also present, even if that person has passed on, who are also present at the very end of the story as well. And then they can begin to rank those characters who are the closest to the center versus more transient characters who kind of maybe come and go, or they appear early on in a formative part of the story, but then, fade as the story progresses through its pages. And I think that can also be really important because memoir is very highly scene-based. That means that, approximately 50 to 80% of the story sometimes is told in scenes. And just knowing that you have not a cast of 20 people, but really a much smaller cast of maybe 4 or 5 people to take care of can again put limits on the story that feel like a comfort. Now, once those core key characters are identified, say, for example, the constellation in a family of child, mother, and father, then we begin to touch on things like theme. What if this story that you thought was really about just childhood adventure really ended up being a story about father and son? Now, all of a sudden, we begin to get into deeper things. And here's where I'm going to come back to the narrator. The narrator is so important in creative nonfiction. This character that we build is really like a tour guide that walks us through the forest and tells us, okay, look at this tree, look at those leaves, and here's why. We need that person to guide us through. It's our emotional connection to the story as well as our sensory one. If it's raining on the narrator's skin, we feel it. But without that person, we can't have any access to the sensory world of the story. So the narrator very often in nonfiction and memoir form is 2 people. We have the child who lived through the scenes of their family life at home. And then we have an older, wiser narrator who is sitting at the desk, looking back, making sense of those things. And here I think sometimes, memoir we often worry that we're going to say sensational things about people that are going to hurt their feelings sometimes when we're writing personal narrative. But I think that this older, wiser writer who's looking back in the story is a kind of a journalist of their own life. And in a way, they have kind of a neutral curiosity about the events that have happened. And they are looking to fulfill a deeper need in the story. Oftentimes, it's to answer a much larger question of how this little tiny story that happened to one family or one person fits into larger patterns in the world. So these can be things like larger social movements, diasporic history, intergenerational inheritances, sometimes even economics and politics, potentially even environmental and planetary concerns. To give you an example of what I mean, this is Alicia Elliott's book of mine, Spread Out on the Ground. And it is a memoir, it's an essay collection. And in this story, in this book, she has a piece called Dark Matter, I believe it's called. I might have gotten the title wrong. But anyways, the story about her relationship with Chips Ahoy cookies. Now, the story on the surface is about Chips Ahoy, and she writes about eating Chips Ahoy and about how they form this kind of culinary memory for her. But really, the story is about something much deeper than that. It's about the effects of colonialism and intergenerational trauma in Indigenous communities. And even though the author is writing about cookies, it's really about something more deeper and thematic than that. So, having said all those things, who are the people walking around in the story, and also where is the timeline? I think just being able to narrow those things is really important and a comfort, because of course books get started all the time and people often will fall off. And even as experienced writers, we have abandoned projects midway, probably most of us, because they lacked viability in some form. So even knowing where those goalposts are, I think can reduce a lot of decision fatigue later on in the middle stages of the writing. And it can be really quite useful just to know what you don't have to write about. So it's a relief. That's it for me.
Wow, thanks, Charlotte. Wonderful advice from you, and nice way to think about a book. I love thinking about constraints and the kind of creativity that they can facilitate. So thank you very much. We're going to go now to Kim Pittaway, who's going to talk to us about the benefits and challenges of ghostwriting. Welcome, Kim.
Great. Thanks, Jillian. And I just want to start off by saying that one of the great things about being involved in this King's program is getting to listen to my extremely knowledgeable and talented colleagues. Because every time I hear Dean talk about research, he makes me want to, log on to newspapers.com and poke around in there some more. And I learn so much every time I hear Charlotte speak. So yeah, I'm already thinking about projects that I'm working on where her advice is going to help me. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about ghostwriting and the challenges, the rewards, and the ins and outs of ghostwriting. I know that ghostwriting is something that many journalists and other writers are interested in getting into, finding opportunities in that area. And I would say that ghostwriting generally is, I think, a kind of a growing area right now, because there is interest in more and more first person stories or first person involved stories. But many of the people whose stories publishers may be interested in may not have the skills to tell their own story on the page in the way that a publisher would want them to, or to be able to get those words down onto the page. So there is opportunity for ghostwriters who can take on that work of translating someone else's experience onto the page in a way that is engaging to readers. So why don't I start by talking a little bit about what ghostwriting is and what the scope of that is. So ghostwriting is essentially writing someone else's story, stepping into their eye, literal, the literal eye, not well, the letter I, stepping into the letter I for them and writing as if you were them. But there is a continuum of ghostwriting and how that might actually show up on the published page. There's kind of ghostwriting where you're engaged by someone to take on this task, and you can't, for reasons in your contract, tell even your mother who you're writing the book for. So where the non-disclosure is that tight that you can't tell anyone outside of your agent and editor and the person you're working with what project you're working on. And that continuum extends from that really invisible ghost all the way up to a co-author relationship, where you might have a cover credit, where you might in fact do some publicity with your co-author and be engaged in post-publication promotion of the project. And then there's everything in between, where you might not have a cover credit, but you might have a title page credit, or you might just be thanked very effusively in the acknowledgments section. So lots of range in there, and it will depend on your needs, your interests, and the needs and interests of the person whose story you're trying to tell. So what if you've never ghostwritten before, though? How do you take that first step into ghostwriting? There are a few different routes into ghostwriting, I think, and some considerations about what kind of experience you need to be able to bring to that proposition. Certainly, if you're trying to pitch yourself as a ghostwriter or someone is approaching you to ghostwrite a project, they're going to want to see or will have seen some evidence that you have the writing chops to carry this off, right? So if they're approaching you, often it will be because they've seen either another book that you've written or that you're a journalist with a name and stature in a particular area. And so they're approaching you because of that visibility. If you're approaching them, you're going to want to carry into that conversation the proof that you have the ability to carry this off. So this might be that you've published books. It might be that you have other writing credits. It might be that you have deep subject expertise and some writing skill, but you're going to need to provide some kind of proof that you can carry this off. It doesn't necessarily have to be that you've published a book. I did my project with TUFA before I published anything of my own at book length, but I did have a manuscript in progress of my own that I could share with her, and she could get a sense of the kind of writing that I was doing. And she could also see other publications that I had worked on and other work that I published in the past. So that was enough proof for her that I could tell her story in a meaningful way. You may also have a connection to the person whose story you want to tell. So you may spot that story yourself. They may not realize that they have a story worth telling, and you may approach them and say, hey, I think you've got a story worth telling. I'd like to work with you to get this onto the page. So that may be another entry point for you where you're actually pitching someone on allowing you to tell their story, a story they may not have realized had publication legs potentially. So all kinds of routes into it. There are also other avenues into ghostwriting. Agents are often looking for ghostwriters, and agencies, I think, these days are doing more and more work to match ghostwriters to projects. So it's not unusual, for instance, for within agencies, for the agencies themselves to have a sense of who on their roster is interested and capable of doing ghostwriting. And then also sometimes to work within the agency to match folks who approach them, celebs, politicians, business people who may have stature but not the skill, to match those people within the agency and then take that product out to a publisher. Publishers themselves also are looking for ghostwriters, so may also start from that starting point of, oh, we think this HGTV personality is, someone that we could get behind their brand and get a book or two or three, but we need to match them with a writer along the way. So then the publisher may look to their own roster of authors that they've worked with, or may reach out to agents to connect with authors. So there are a lot of opportunities there to make it known to a network that you're interested, and to make those kinds of connections along the way, to connect with agents who may be seeking ghostwriters for their clients or through their agency, to make connections with publishers and let publishers know that you're engaged and interested in this as well. On that on that publisher front, I think it's also worth noting that there are a couple of different categories of publishers who are engaging ghostwriters. There are the traditional publishers like the Penguin Random House Canada, like HarperCollins, like Simon & Schuster, like ECW. But there are also custom publishers out there who are more and more positioning themselves as offering full packages to people. So what we might have in the past called vanity presses are now positioning themselves as hybrid presses or full service presses. And so someone who is a psychiatrist who is interested in publishing a book because they want to position themselves as a brand in some way, or a business leader who wants to cement their authority and go on the speaking gig tour, will contact one of these hybrid publishers, and through them connect with a ghostwriter, connect with editors, connect with designers, and have a full package done for them. So those hybrid publishers are also seeking ghostwriters to work with them. And in Canada, you know, there are a handful of them. I think of Barlow Books. I think of Page Two Books, and out on the West Coast. In the U.S., there are a number of them, but one who pops to mind just because he's been quite active on social media lately, saying he's actively looking for ghostwriters, is Kevin Anderson and Associates, and they're a company out of New York that does a lot of these kinds of book packages that are geared to positioning people as authorities or influencers, or you know, the book becomes the leading edge of their reason for going on speaking tours and other things. So making those kinds of connections can also be an entry point to doing ghostwriting. So what should you consider when you're thinking about taking on a ghostwriting project, whether you're thinking about approaching someone to see if they would be interested in having you ghostwrite their story, or whether someone is approaching you? What kinds of questions should you ask? I think one of the key questions is this a story you want to help tell? Because you're going to be up to your neck in this story for at least a couple of years, solidly 18 months anyway. And is this the book you want to spend your time working on? Is there a message here that you feel committed to? Is there a narrative here that is interesting or challenging to you? There are all kinds of reasons to take on a project, but you really do want to make sure that there is something in here that's going to keep the spark alive, because trust me, there will be moments where the spark will die. There will be moments where it's challenging to work with someone else on their project, and you will need to reconnect with, why am I doing this? And connecting and knowing why you're taking this on in the first place is really important along the way. Is it someone that you can work with? You know, typically in these arrangements, you will have at least a couple of conversations, sort of, you know, not quite speed dating, but not really date dating, but you'll have some conversations with your potential partner along the way. And it's important to trust your gut. Is this somebody that you can work with? You're going to be spending hours and hours and hours talking to this person. Are they interesting? Are they engaging? Do you get the sense that they're going to be forthcoming? If they're not particularly forthcoming, are they someone who you can draw material out of? Again, you know, as the story might have appealed to you, but once you meet the person, is this somebody whose story you want to help get onto the page? Trust your gut, because again, you're in this for a year, 2 years, and you're going to be working quite closely with this person. An unhappy relationship of any kind is an unhappy relationship, and if you can head that off, you want to try and head that off. Is it a story that someone ultimately will want to publish? If the publisher's coming to you, if the agent's coming to you, yes, someone else has probably already determined that there's interest in publishing this. But if you're approaching someone directly, you do want to give some thought about who will be interested in this story, how will you position this? Because in many cases, before you get to that publisher stage, you are going to have to spend the time to actually draft that book proposal, because that's often the first step in the ghostwriting process. The arrangement often is that you'll take on drafting the proposal as a first step, and then there will be sort of a second clause to the contract that if the proposal is accepted, that you will then be the person who takes on the writing of the book project from there. And often you're compensated with a specific fee for the proposal, and then the negotiation around the fee for the book project itself happens at the point at which a publisher is interested in the project. If the person is self-publishing, that will shift in some ways, and you'll have more of that conversation about overall fee probably at the front end of the project. But I would always encourage you, even if the project is one that is driven by the co-author, you're the person whose book you're writing themselves, even if the process is driven by them and they say, oh, we don't need a book proposal, we don't need a book proposal. Trust me, you need a book proposal, because that book proposal is going to be your guide through this journey, and it's going to ensure that you are both clear on what the parameters of the book are from the outset. So you do want to take the time to do that book proposal, that chapter outline, and even a sample chapter or two to make sure that you're traveling the road together. What's the arrangement likely to be then from there? As I said, you're probably going to possibly going to separate the book proposal from the manuscript itself. So that might be in 2 stages. The fee might be in 2 parts, a fee for the proposal, then a fee for the project itself. You want clarity on who's paying you and whether they have the funds to pay you. So, are you relying on the fact that you're going to do the book proposal for X amount, and then a publisher will come on board and your fee will be coming out of that publisher's fee to the author? Or is it that the co-author themselves is going to pay you out of pocket for that publication, for that work? So you just need to be clear about that. You want to be clear about what the timeline is. Is the interviewing and research going to take place over 6 months, over 9 months? Do you have a year to delivery of the draft? That would be typical, but there certainly are many cases where that timeline from acceptance to delivery of the draft could be much, much tighter. And so how will you arrange your life around that? What will your subject's availability be? And how clear can you be about that in the arrangements up front? I will guarantee you that there will be moments of frustration at someone else's availability or lack of availability, or their desire to be available on Saturday night at 8 o'clock when you would really rather not be dealing with them then. But you want to set some boundaries where you can, but also recognize that kind of your time is not really going to be entirely your own. And just as it's important to recognize that, as with when we are writing our own projects, where we may engage in some strategic avoidance of the writing, the person whose story you are telling will also be engaging in some strategic avoidance along the way. And you need to build that into your timeline, because there will be times where they're dodging your calls, where they're not making time to speak with you, and you need to build that into your timeline along the way. Really, the process, yes, is a process of research and writing. It is also a process of project management, of people management. And if you need to ask yourself the very honest question of how much you want to wrangle somebody else, because a big part of this is wrangling the person that you're working with. So the challenges and the rewards. The challenges, it's not about you. You're not telling your story, and ultimately what ends up on the page is their story. You do need to build in that avoidance time, because that will absolutely happen. And there will be many times when your time is not your own, where you're working to someone else's schedule. What are the rewards? Well, the good news is it's not about you. So if you're writing someone else's book, it's not, you're not bearing yourself on the page, you're helping someone else bear themselves on the page, which, can be rewarding and exciting and exhilarating. You're also getting the opportunity to understand someone else's perspective and to step into their eye, step into someone else's life and bring that story to life. And then there are the craft and business rewards. There are the craft rewards of structuring a story, of working with that material on the page, getting it onto the page, which is so satisfying. And there are the financial rewards. I will say that, as with all Canadian publishing, don't attach yourself to the American dollar signs that we see touted in the press about ghostwriters, because I will tell you, the Canadian rates, not quite what Prince Harry's ghostwriter was getting, but you certainly can earn reasonable money through this, and it's certainly a nice way to augment other kinds of streams of writing revenue along the way. So I'm going to wrap up there. Thanks, everyone.
Wow, thank you, Kim. That was fantastic. And of course, the whole time you were speaking, I was compiling a list of people who I plan to ghostwrite for. So thanks for the inspiration. I'm now going to turn things over to Stephen Kimber, who's going to talk to us about working with publishers of all sizes. Stephen.
Thank you, Jillian, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's great to see so many people out there who are interested in writing books. Just a reminder, I see that there are now some questions in the chat, but if you have questions you want to put into the chat, we will definitely get to them at the end of the presentation. As Jillian mentioned in the intro, I've been published by many different publishers. When I was starting out as a journalist, I bounced from job to job so often that people would ask me if I had a problem keeping one. And you may ask the same question about me in publishing, but for our purposes today, I do like to think of my background as a plus. My goal today is really just to offer you a quick and dirty overview of what I see as the current publishing landscape. It is a what I see and not necessarily what is overview. Reasonable people disagree on the state of publishing in the world these days. And I'd be happy to answer any questions, of course, at the end of the presentations too. There are advantages and disadvantages to whatever publishing choices you make, or whatever choice circumstances make for you, because oftentimes you may start out with one objective and discover that there is maybe even a better one than you knew when you started. So let's start with the big publishers, because for many of us, especially starting out, the big three, big four, big five, however you wanted to calculate it, were the publishing holy grail. Today in Canada, it's really three companies: HarperCollins, Penguin Random House, and Simon & Schuster. Now, there was a time when editors at the big houses would nurture promising young writers, looking, 3 or 4 books down the road for a book to finally earn out its advance, and then for their authors to become commercially successful and be able to have careers as authors. That really doesn't exist anymore in this country, or probably anywhere in the world. Publishing at that level, the big houses, has become very much a big business. There's mergers and acquisitions and all those funny agglomerated names like Random Penguins and others. The big publishers are owned by global corporations for whom books are really just another kind of widget. And the books are judged by their sales. Sales of this particular book, not what might happen with the next book. And if this book doesn't do very well, the chances of a next book are not all that great. Editors' decisions these days are governed by what called I'm calling it the evil P&L, profit and loss calculations. Now, this never happened when I started out in the business. But the fact is that these days, editors at the bigger houses need to make an educated guess right away about how well your book will sell, how many copies will be bought. And they have to create a kind of spreadsheet to make that educated guess seem mathematical and achievable. And then they have to be accountable for whatever happens when the book is published in the quirky world of book buyers. And these days, I think it's probably fair to say that the editors need a book that will sell 10,000 plus copies to justify an investment in one of those big houses. There are definitely advantages to being with a big publisher. First of all, they are big. And then that means they have a team behind your book. They have marketing and publicity. We're not talking here about marketing and publicity. We're often talking about marketing department, publicity department, doing slightly different things to help get your book out there. They have a distribution network. They know the people who are involved in the business at every level, and they know who the right people are in those networks to get your book out there and noticed by people who matter, that would give your book its best shot at exposure. But there are also disadvantages to the big publishers, especially for writers starting out. First of all, you need an agent, or at least a close family connection, to get you inside the door. The fact is that big publishers are so inundated with pitches and proposals that they really have no time to look at pitches that aren't in one way or another brought to them by somebody they can trust. So that's a big negative for starting writers and big publishers. The other thing is that because they're big, it's very easy to get lost. They're publishing oftentimes hundreds of titles a year, and they need to make choices about which ones to put their resources, their limited resources, even for big publishers, behind. Now, I sort of have this sense of the unfolding world of publishing when you sign your book deal with any publisher, but particularly a big publisher. You're the best thing that's ever happened to them, and they really just can't wait for your manuscript to show up in their inbox 2 years from now. And then you go through that whole process, and the day your book comes out, you realize that those same editors and other people in the publishing house have had to make a choice among 5 other titles that are being published that week. Who's going to get the limited marketing dollars? So it's you should always be grateful for those wonderful words at the beginning of the process, but always know that there is a but at the end of the process for most of us, where the question and the answer changes. The other thing about when you're with a big house with all those books coming out, the time that you have to make an impression is pretty brief. 3 weeks, 6 weeks, and then they're on to the next titles. If your book hasn't found traction in that time from their use of publicity and marketing, then it starts to fade into the background. That's not to say that there are not books, and a lot of very successful books, that didn't start out with traction, but the slow drumbeat of hand selling of publicity from one person to the other will make that book into something. And then the big publishers also have the wherewithal to jump on that and to help you make that into something much bigger. The way in which big publishing works now, though, has also, and this is, I think, the important thing for many of us, is opened the door for smaller publishers, mid-sized publishers. There are now more than 100 independent English language book publishers in Canada who are members of the Association of Canadian Publishers, and there are probably a lot that are not. So that's a lot of other people out there to pitch to. One thing you should know, I didn't mention it in terms of the big publishing houses, because the big publishing houses are the result of all these different mergers along the way. They have a whole bunch of imprints, but one of the things that you will discover is that they don't bid against each other to try to get an author. So if you're talking to one of the many imprints at HarperCollins, that's who is bidding on your book, not six other imprints there in that big company. So the smaller publishers tend to be regional specialty, or they're just smaller than the big publishers. But they have filled the gap in many ways when it comes to mentoring and investing in authors' careers. It's still a business, of course, but I think editors at many of those smaller houses have more freedom to make quirky choices based on their own reading of your book and what they think about your book. And those often pay off without those books necessarily ever becoming bestsellers. Advantages of these smaller and medium publishers: you don't always need an agent to be considered. And that is a good thing for many of us. It's a way to talk directly to editors, to sell directly to editors without having to go through the middle person of an agent. But it's also bad. Agents understand the business side of publishing better than we ever will. If you don't have an agent, but you do get an offer from a publisher, one thing I would suggest right off the top is to pay a lawyer. Probably cost you $500 to $750, something in that range, who specializes in authors and the arts, to take a look at your contract. Because this is not to suggest that those publishers are trying to cheat you out of your returns, but they are operating generally with standard contracts that always inevitably favor them in some slight way or another. But then they're not averse to negotiating to giving you back rights that they're probably not going to exercise anyway, like film and television rights and other things. But if you have those rights, then if somebody comes along and wants to make a movie of your book, you're in a much better position to get all of the benefits of that rather than splitting them 50-50 with the publisher. So it's important that even if you don't have an agent, you do spend the time and perhaps the money to get the kind of advice that you may want. Now, small publishers, quite obviously, publish fewer titles than the big ones, but they're more invested in them, or this is sort of my sense of it, because they aren't doing 100 books at a time. It's an opportunity for you to stand out on their list in a way that you might not on a big list. And you'll be more likely submitted for awards and other things that can generate not only prize money, but also publicity and more sales for your books. And the more sales that you have, the more the publisher is going to be interested in your next book. Now, as much as we may hate Amazon for all sorts of good reasons, one of the things that is a benefit when it comes to small publishers is that, unlike before, where you get stuff out to booksellers, it would be on the shelves for a period of time. It sold, it didn't sell, it ends up going back to the publisher, and it sort of disappears. Amazon and Indigo can take your book published by a small publisher in Halifax or Winnipeg or wherever and make it available to the world. You may be surprised by how many readers will find your book as a result. And over a longer period of time than they would normally be available in bookstores. So in other words, you're still selling a book from 10 years ago, more copies because it's being discovered by more people in more places. Not many, not huge numbers, but that keeps that backlist of yours generating revenue for you. Now, there are disadvantages to being published by a smaller publisher. For one thing, you need to be, I think, and you need to be anyway, but you need to be more proactively involved in your book's marketing and publicity. In particular, the small publisher's version of your marketing and publicity team in the big world of major publishers, it may be that your marketing and publishing team is really just maybe one overworked freelance publicist on the phone. The secret, and I think this is true regardless of whether you're talking small publishers or big publishers or your own self-publishing, is that you need to be your own best advocate for your book. Now, that doesn't mean that you want to be critical of what others are doing for you to help out, but you have to understand that the more invested you are in the process, and I think this is something I discovered over the years. When I started out, I thought my job was really done when the book was published, but in fact, it is not. It is really just beginning, and you have to understand that, and you have to understand that you need to help, whether it's a publicist or the team at a larger publishing house, or the person that you hire to do this for yourself, just to make sure that it's your message is getting out there and your book is discoverable by your audience. The last opportunity in publishing I'm going to talk about briefly is self-publishing or independent publishing. Clearly, it used to be vanity stuff. This is how Aunt Vera's collection of recollections of growing up on the farm, or Uncle Milt's lessons from 40 years selling tires, would get published and gather dust on family shelves. That, of course, still exists, but it's no longer just that at all. And I think for some authors, one of the great advantages of self-publishing is control. You have control of the editing, the packaging, the promotion, and you are the person who will therefore benefit at the end with much higher earnings on each book. I mean, commercially published royalties average probably in the 8 to 10% range. Self-publishers are really looking at 40 to 70% of the cover price coming back to them. You can sell fewer books and make more money per book as a self-publisher, who does it right? And we've all read the stories. I mean, Colleen Hoover self-published her first book so her mom would have something to read on her new Kindle. And she's since sold 20 million copies. Now she's been picked up by a conventional publisher. Last year, Time Magazine named her one of the most influential people in the world. So we can dream. But a little reality. Dr. Google tells me there are 300 million self-published books out there, with another 3.5 new titles every 3.5 million new titles every year. The unfortunate side effect of that is the average self-published title sells about 250 copies, and that's the average. That said, there's some good news. If you write in the right genres, romance, crime and mystery, sci-fi and fantasy, religious and inspirational titles, you have a much better opportunity to find your audience through self-publishing than perhaps you do if you're writing literary fiction as your outlet. But last year, with the categories that I mentioned there in terms of self-publishing sold more than $3 billion worth of books. But you still have to get your book noticed. So control also means responsibility, and that's depending on who you are, it can be the downside of the self-publishing world. You have to take it seriously. You're not just a writer at this point, but you're also kind of a small business person. You hire editors, copy editors, proofreaders, book designers. You have to do those things if you want to have a professionally published product, even just one that is self-published by you. Can you afford a publicist? Who's paying for the wine at your book launch? Do you sort of need to create, what a terrible thing, your own profit and loss statement to figure out whether this is really worth it? Wouldn't you rather just write? All of which, of course, depends on your own publishing desires and hopes and expectations and your willingness to play all the different roles. I'll stop there, but just to say one last bit of advice, and this does apply to every kind of publishing. If you're serious about it, take it seriously. Study the possibilities, the pitfalls, and then go for it. With that, I'll just turn it back to you, Jillian.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen. And that was such a comprehensive overview of a very complicated and ever-changing industry. So much appreciated. Thanks. And I'll just broadly say thanks to all of my colleagues today, because I've been fortunate enough to be their student at different times, and I still have the wonderful opportunity to be their student again in panels like this. So thank you all for such a rich discussion. I'm going to finish things off with a topic that perhaps we don't think too much about as writers, especially when we're just starting our early projects, and that is connecting with a community of writers and thinking about ourselves beyond our books. And this is, I think, important to talk about because you can be deeply immersed in your project to the point where you are maybe even what some might call antisocial, but certainly less social than you might normally be. And all of a sudden, then your book comes out, and what happens there? How do you get it into people's hands? And this is what you have to be thinking about along the way as you're writing your book, is creating that community, not just of writers who are around you and support you, but also of readers and your potential audience. So I'm going to talk about two primary things you can do as you're working on your project that don't interfere too much, but really work to kind of support you as a writer as you're developing your manuscript. The first is the writing group, and the second is more about kind of reaching out to a bigger community through things like writing a newsletter. So with the writers group, it's one of the fastest and easiest ways to create community. It's a wonderful outlet when you're deep in the process of writing a book and you can't find your way out of that, to connect with fellow writers who are also deep in their projects and are feeling lost is a good way to recenter yourself, to bring yourself out of that jumble that's in your mind and in your computer files, to get a little bit of perspective and to feel some relief from the work and the toil of producing a book. we are now in an era, especially post-pandemic, where creating a writing group is a lot easier than it might have been in the past, especially if you're in a remote area. So we can meet online with fellow writers, and we can meet in person in different ways. And much like book clubs, writing groups have become a little bit codified. So you can go online and do a Google search, how to start a writing group, where are writing groups in my area, what are the best practices of a writing group, and actually find some pretty good answers. There's a lot of really good articles telling you how you might want to format yours, how you might want to think about who you work with, and what it might look like from your particular authorial point of view. So I'll just briefly use my group as an example. We were fortunate enough to come together in the King's MFA. We were all students in the same cohort. And at the time when we formed our group, which was in 2015, we all lived in the same city. So there were a Toronto contingent of us that decided to get together with the purpose of workshopping each other's chapters. So we would meet in person about once a month. We would usually have 1 or 2 chapters we were workshopping, and we would use the rest of the time we were together to socialize. So it was very kind of clear format, and it worked very well until 2020. At that point, of course, we had to shift online, as everybody did. And we actually, at that point, moved it to a weekly meeting, and we have continued that weekly meeting ever since. So we spend 1 hour together every Friday morning. This has taken a variety of formats. So initially we were workshopping, but you can do all kinds of things like stop thinking about your book and just talk about general writing craft. You can enter a contest together. Perhaps there's a short story contest out there or a personal essay contest that is fitting to all of the projects that you're working on. Why not take that time to create together and submit together and share in each other's victories if anyone succeeds in that contest? You might want to talk generally about things like story arcs or ways of writing a proposal. Books that you've been reading, of course, is a huge topic of conversation for writers. You might also just want to gather together and write silently, because what this enables is a sort of sacred space and time that you've created together, where you are bound to this promise of creating in that moment. You can't have other interruptions. And even if you're just sitting at home and you've all decided to get on Zoom for an hour and sit and type at your keyboards, there are those 3 or 4 other people who are on your screen who are watching you and will know if you get up 20 times to go feed the cat and get yourself another snack and distract yourself with other things in the house. And instead, you're going to have to face, them watching you and knowing whether or not you're writing. So it's about the act of creating space with each other for the purpose of focusing on yourself as a writer and each other as fellow craftspeople. So the benefits of forming a writing group include a regular writing practice, however that looks for you, keeping you connected to that writing community at large, thinking about and reformatting and changing and adapting your writing goals, because in conversation, we will often get a better sense of who we are as artists and how to make adjustments so that we understand where we're heading with our writing projects. It keeps us accountable to both yourself and each other. And it's a social outlet, which is wonderful, but also a professional one that really can provide you some, thorough and really thoughtful feedback. So when it comes to getting started, you want to be specific in your search. I really feel lucky that I benefited from, getting along so well with my fellow writing group members. But you do want to really be careful about who you choose to work with. So think about things like, how often do you want to meet? Where are you going to meet? What is your ability to commit to this group? And what do you want out of your interaction with this group? If you're somebody who is producing a chapter a week and you want feedback on those chapters every single week, you're going to have to find writers who are kind of in that same zone, right? You're not necessarily going to want to work with a writer who's producing a chapter every 6 months because they have many other obligations. Or if they are producing a chapter every 6 months, perhaps they're very willing to read one of your chapters every other week, right? So think about that kind of rate of production and the expectation level of the fellow writers in your group. Think about how much of it will be social. Sometimes writers just want to gather so that they can vent about other things. and talk about, you know, reading and writing more broadly, and they don't necessarily want to talk about their projects, how much time are you going to dedicate to that social interaction versus the actual craft interaction that you're having? Think about things like genre. If you are writing historical nonfiction, do you want to be meeting with a group of mystery and fiction novel writers? Perhaps not, because you're going to be facing very distinct challenges in your projects. That said, maybe those mystery and romance novelists will be able to offer a lens on a historical nonfiction project that you wouldn't necessarily get from writers in the same genre. So these are the questions you're going to be kind of asking yourself as you cast about for fellow writers. Then when it comes time to actually put it together, there's different ways you can advertise. So one is just a big Google search. You know, you live in Calgary, you want to meet fellow writers, type in writing group Calgary. And I did that just recently, and I found all kinds of different groups of different sizes, venues, seriousness. You know, you can find the kind of group that's right for you, or the kind of venue that offers a space for writing groups to meet, at which you could do a kind of speed dating, casual conversation testing of different writers that you may or may not end up working with. Think about community sort of spaces. So community centers, libraries, grocery stores, laundry rooms, you know, places where people might be sort of passing by and looking at community notices and might have an interest in joining with you, especially if you want to meet in a very specific physical region. Social media is another great place. And if you're willing to meet online, then of course you can cast much more widely and look for people who are working again in similar genres or at similar stages of career as you are, and see if somebody there in your kind of social media circles might be willing to work with you. The other thing I say is ask your neighbors. You know, we're in a kind of modern world where we don't really talk to our neighbors so much anymore, but I do, because I live in a co-op. And I have a lot of artists living in this co-op with me, and I see them all the time, and discovered one of my neighbors was a writer. And so we actually have fairly frequent meetings where we just talk about writing craft. It's very casual. We sit down for a coffee, we talk for an hour. She calls me up on the phone. She writes YA fantasy books. I write modern nonfiction books. We don't have anything in common genre-wise, but we have lots to talk about craft-wise. So it can be in the places that you least expect. And then when you get together, sort of figure out the rules of the arrangement and how you're going to work together, how you're going to workshop and give each other feedback, what the frequency you're meeting is, and the frequency with which you're submitting chapters to the other members of the group. When it comes to thinking about other ways to connect with community, there are lots of opportunities. And again, I think we're benefiting from a post-pandemic, if we want to call it that, world where we've understood that we can do things online in ways that we were only doing in person in the past. So the first thing I would say is, if you're looking for ways to meet people and find out about what they're doing as writers, go to events. Go to literary events, author readings, workshops, classes, wherever you can find something connected to the book world, go. But it may not be that easy for you. Maybe you have a really packed schedule, you have family responsibilities, you work 2 jobs, you know, this may not be super easy for you to do, but many of those events that are happening in bookstores and libraries are being recorded. Or they're happening online and recordings are being made of them. You can watch those recordings later and find out about those authors that you're interested in. So find your ways around, you know, the festivals, the authors, federations and organizations in your province or in your city or town that are offering those events, and see what interests you and who might be connected to those particular events that you either go to in person or follow up with online. The other place to build community, both among writers and readers, is the newsletter. So right now, Substack seems to be the preferred platform that many writers and artists of other types are using. But I don't think you have to be tied to any one platform option. You can, if you want to keep it simple, just simply write emails on a somewhat regular basis. You know, it can be weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, every 6 months, that you send out to your family, friends, and colleagues. With the newsletter, I encourage you to think about focusing on one specific aspect of your writing. So with my Substack, I write about the books I'm reading, and I usually I'll write one every 2 or 3 months, and I'll send it out to my network and I'll say, here's what I've read in the last few months. Here's what I liked. Here's what I didn't like. Also, here's the music I'm listening to. It's very casual. It's an opportunity for me to be a little bit of a book reviewer and to talk about books, which I love to do. But it has nothing really to do with the rest of my writing. So I don't put the rest of my writing into my Substack. It's a totally separate thing. What it's allowing me to do is connect with other writers and to remind my audience that I'm here. I'm still working. I'm still writing things. Even though you haven't heard from me for 6 months, here's, something I have to say. And that's the benefit of newsletters. They can be very casual. Your audience can read them very quickly. And if you're interested in following other writers, you get insight into their craft. You get really niche topics, sometimes on different subjects to do with writing. They might be writing about issues that you're interested in. They might be doing something as niche as, following the progression of the Oxford comma in literature of, the 21st century, right? And something that niche might be specific only to that newsletter, but what it does is it opens up interest in people who are interested in the comma to read more of what that author has to say. So suddenly they write a book about something else. Well, you like their voice and their style and their way of talking about the comma. So maybe you'll read this book that they have on, 19th century England or something. So it's a way to connect with people in a less serious and less committed way than just giving them a book that you've written. And it's a way for you to think about your fellow writers as your peers, as your support group, and as your fellow practitioners. And what ultimately I think both writing newsletters and creating writing groups does is it creates what we're always hoping to achieve as educators in writing, which is a sense of community and being connected to each other and creating that support system. Because if we think about writing as competition and all of us working in these little silos and being pitted against each other, we don't do each other any favors, and we don't create what I think art should be, which is a social network and a connection to each other on an ongoing basis. And so if you come from that perspective of, I will help this person and they will help me eventually, and we're all going to be sort of riding this high of giving each other congratulations, supporting each other's work, and celebrating the great moments that happen in our writing careers, then your book will be a far bigger success when it comes out than if you had simply written in silence and quiet and then pushed it into the world without telling anybody about it. So that's a nice way, I think, to think about community and the way that you can sort of build it up over time as you're working on your projects at length. I'm going to stop here so we have a bit of time left for questions. And what I'm going to do is go back to the early questions in the chat. Those that haven't been answered or that require some more discussion, we'll start with those. And we'll just kind of work our way through until our time ends. And I encourage you, if you have more questions coming up as you're listening to the answers, to pop them in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I do want to come back to this very first question we have about Canadian nonfiction, because Dean gave us an answer, but I think it opens up to some more discussion here. And the question is, Charlotte Gray recently painted a fairly dire picture of Canadian nonfiction, and what is our take on that? How can nonfiction authors, especially those just starting out, navigate that challenge? So I'm going to open this up to the panel. Thoughts on that?
Well, I'll jump in then just to follow up on what I put in the chat. Yes, I mean, Charlotte Gray's right. This challenge, though, this complaint is not new. I've been hearing it 5-10 years. And the problem is this, that especially historical nonfiction is extremely labor intensive. Same with journalistic investigations, same with scientific investigations. And Canada's a small market. We have big publishers, but they only have so much room in their lists. And so in some senses, yeah, it's dire if you want to be a full-time nonfiction writer, but it's dire if you want to be a full-time writer in Canada. So it's demoralizing in the sense that publishers expect you to do all this work basically with maybe very little advance, sometimes with minimal advance. On the other hand, if you're writing a novel, publishers would expect probably to have a draft of the novel to read, which they wouldn't have paid you a cent to do. So there is sort of a labor of love aspect to it. Don't quit your day jobs. Charlotte's been lucky. She was able to quit day jobs, and she does candidly say in that piece that if her spouse didn't have a full-time job, it would be challenging. So I just hope folks aren't totally demoralized by that, because there are smaller publishers, and as I pointed out in chat, that may offer smaller advances, but might still do more aggressive job, or might be more open to what you want to do. So dire, but perhaps no more dire than the business has ever been.
Yeah, I would jump in to second what Dean has said, and also to point out, especially for writers who are starting out, first time authors have always been unlikely to get the great big huge advance off the beginning of all of this. So for someone who's starting out, I don't think that the situation really is all that different than it has been in the past. What Charlotte was talking about, yes, is the size of the advances has, I think, gone down, or it's certainly stayed at a certain level but not kept up with inflation and other changes. As well, she was talking about some changes at the Canada Council, and how the Canada Council is allocating funds to applicants who are working on nonfiction projects, and I think that that's a source of some ongoing frustration and irritation. But those Canada Council changes aren't necessarily reflected at every provincial or regional arts council, so there may still be opportunities there. But again, at those arts council levels, often those funds aren't easily accessible to first-time authors. Often you do have to have some publications under your belt already to access those. So is it an issue? Yes, it is. Are there opportunities to be published? Yes, there are lots of opportunities to be published. And, you know, I don't know too many people who actually sustain themselves to the end of writing a book who are doing it only for the money. So, I think we're all doing this for a mix of reasons. Should we expect to be fairly compensated? Yes, I think we should, and I think we should all advocate to be fairly compensated. But the reality is, as Dean said, not many of us can afford uh, to be only writing. We may be doing some writing and some teaching and some other things along the way that create, in the language of profit and loss statements, multiple revenue streams for us to be able to sustain ourselves. And it sure doesn't hurt if one of those multiple revenue streams is a partner who's revenue streaming in your direction, but not all of us have that opportunity. So
Thanks, Kim. And I'll just add to that we were in a session recently with agents who also painted a similarly dire picture, but then at the end they said, we're still in this business, and we're in this business because we are perennial optimists, and we know there are good stories that are always just around the corner, and they live for those stories. So don't fret too much. You might have that story that catches that agent's or editor's eye, and you'll make that book come to life, and there's no reason to let this picture of the industry prevent you from creating the art that you need to. Kim, there's another question for you. Do you recommend a certain type or form of writing to those without ghostwriting experience to get closer to being able to take such a project on?
So I answered it a little bit in the chat by saying it kind of depends on the kind of project you're going after. So if you're interested in tackling business books or telling, entrepreneurial stories, then having publication credits that reflect that kind of writing will help. If you're interested in telling, certain kinds of first-person adventure stories, then having written for outdoor magazines can help. I know that when I worked with Tufa, that certainly what helped tip the balance for her was that I had written all kinds of pieces in women's magazines, but I'd written an awful lot of as told to pieces. So that gave a sense of sort of stepping into someone else's experience, and that I'd written around a lot of the topics that she wanted to explore in her book. So really, it does depend on what kind of stories you're interested in telling, and then targeting those kinds of ghostwriting opportunities. Yeah.
Kim, I'm going to keep you on the line here. Someone wants to dish the dirt on his family through a memoir of his childhood in an exclusive and very posh area of Toronto, and has asked me to write the story. How would you respond to that?
So I did say in the chat that, revenge may be best served cold, but it doesn't always make for a tasty book. And that applies whether we're writing our own memoir or helping someone else write their memoir. Writing solely to, irritate the people who have irritated us along the way doesn't always lead to a great book. That said, if it's Conrad Black's son, there might be interest. So, it really does depend who the family is and what the stories are along the way. I think you need to look at it, first of all, with that sort of cold publishing eyes. Is this a story that some publisher somewhere is going to be interested in tackling? And then looking at it from those questions I asked, posed in the presentation. Is this a story that you want to help tell? Are you going to have some, will you have some good dishy fun with it, or is it going to become tiresome listening to someone grind an axe for weeks on end or months on end? So I would ask myself some of those tough questions. The toughest one being, is it really a book, or is it just somebody grinding an axe? And that's the first question you need to ask.
Thanks. I've skipped over a few questions here in the chat just because we're coming to the end of our session, and I want to get to the ones that weren't answered in the chat. So we have one that says, what if someone has a similar idea to yours? Is there a danger that the market might be flooded, or does it benefit you if a similar title does well? Stephen, Dean, Kim, Charlotte?
Sure. I think it depends. If you think back, this was a while ago, but there was the Briec scandal, the mining scandal that happened out there in the world. And there were like 6 or 7 books that came out. The first one did okay. Later books were actually better, but the market became saturated and nobody was interested in Briec's books anymore. And I think you have to think that for most publishers, unless it's a really big story, they would be much more interested in the first book, not the second or third book in that list. But if it's different enough, you might be able to sell it. You have to think, what makes my book better, different than this other book that is out there or about to be out there. And then you're thinking, if that book is out there or about to be out there, are people still going to be interested in this 2 years, 3 years from now? Because it's at least that long before your book will be out there. So I think, it depends on what the similarities are in your project. But, I would be leery of trying to pitch a book that's too similar to one that has just come out, even if that book has done well, because it isn't that big a market here in Canada for you to think that you can have 5 books on the same subject and they'll all do well.
And if I could jump in on a related issue, the other thing is to stake your territory. I have to credit Charlotte Gray for this. I used to think that, I should go quietly, and the only people who'd find out what I'm doing are archivists and people I might encounter in my research. And her advice was, and I paraphrase, get your foot in the door and hold it open. And so she tells everyone right off the bat, once she's got a contract, and I do think that's something to think about. If you're going to do your book, make sure everyone else knows to get out of your way, because it will be harder for someone else to sell. I know it seems like law of the jungle here, but That's a bit of advice to think about. If someone already has a book out there, and yours is only one of two, then sort of building on what Stephen said, think about how can yours be different, either in terms of focus or storytelling, or maybe you take a wider or a narrower view. Yeah, there's another book on Lincoln, but you're going to focus on one aspect of his life to tell a broader story, that kind of thing. So think about that. Like I said, the minute I get a book contract announced, my webpage is ready to go. I want the world to know to back off.
Thanks. We'll do two more questions and then we'll wrap things up. Suggestions for a small or medium house that might take a chance on art or female empowerment books in Canada. And Kim just posted the answer I was going to give, which is basically to look up small independent presses. There are websites like the Association of Canadian Publishers website that will list publishers and break down what they do, but also you can visit publishers' sites and get a sense of whether your book might fit in there or not. And then Kim's given a list of great places to start. And we are rich, in small and medium-sized publishers here in Canada. Kim, are you going to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say that the other part of the answer that I posted, I think, is as important or more important. Go to a bookstore. Go to a good bookstore that has, especially, and if you're, if you think your book is a book that would be particularly published in Canada, I would say go to a good indie bookstore because they're going to have probably a broader range of Canadian publications. And literally go to the shelf where you think that your book would ultimately end up and look and see what else is on that shelf and who published the stuff that's on that shelf. We used to do an exercise with students in the program where we'd actually have them mock up a cover of their book just on 8x11 paper, and they were pretty, homemade mock-ups. But to have that experience of going and finding the shelf in the bookstore and putting your mocked up cover there on the bookshelf, and who, based on your last name, who's next to you on that shelf, who's on the entire shelf, what's on the end caps, see who's publishing, and that will give you a sense of who's publishing in your field.
Yeah, great advice, Kim. Thank you. Last question is for Stephen. Any tips on getting off to a strong start with book sales right after publishing?
I think the biggest thing is to plan, to organize things. For example, op-eds that might connect back to your book. Anything that you can think of that will get you out into the larger world, where people, well, you'll say something interesting, but people will see it at the bottom of the column or op-ed or commentary or whatever. Such and such is working, or his new book is coming out this week. That adds a little to it. Anything you can do with social media to spice things up. Don't be afraid to excerpt bits, very little bits of your book that will attract attention. I think you do. I mean, you have to work with your publisher on those sorts of things, but anything like that. The one thing I would say that to be cautious of, not in terms of doing it, but in terms of expecting it to be a big deal, is your book launch. Your book launch is for you. It's fun. Make sure that it's fun for you. Invite as many people as you can. Read. Think of events, something that would be fun to connect with your book, but also to bring people in. And maybe in those you'll sell 50 or 60 books, and that's great. I mean, it is a great start to your book publishing, but it is not as important as all those other things that will get your book out there in that larger audience. But still, have fun with it for sure.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, I think we'll probably stop here. I just wanted to say thanks to all of my colleagues for such great advice in a short period of time. We've really done a quick trip through the publishing industry and getting a book started on its way and out the door in just an hour. So thanks for all of your great advice, and to all of you for showing up today and taking time out of your weekend to be with us. We would like to wish you all luck on your publishing projects as you go forward on them. And we also want to invite you to any King's MFA events that come up. We do have a public calendar that's visible on the ukings.ca website. And we have occasional connections to authors who are doing book launches. We have our MFA book club that happens in Halifax, and we have webinars such as this. So please keep watch there and join us again in one of our future events. Thank you again to everybody for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everyone.